Hello and welcome back to the Antilibrary Podcast. This episode is with Professor Patrick Hogan, the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor Emeritus in English at the University of Connecticut. His areas of research and teaching include the history of literary theory, cognitive and neuroscientific approaches to literature, emotion, and narrative, the literature and culture of India, and post-colonial Anglophone literature. He has authored and edited over 25 scholarly books and numerous articles. Most recently, What is Colonialism and Literature and Effective Narratology. He is also a creative writer who wrote the narrative poem The Death of the Goddess. And more recently, he published the novel A People Without Shame. As someone who has had the good fortune of working with Patrick Hogan for my doctoral research, I have always been struck by the way his vast research interests speak with each other, including his creative and critical work. So, without further ado, let's go to Patrick. So, hi, Patrick. Welcome to
Hi.
our podcast. Thanks for agreeing to do this. Yeah. So throughout your career, you have consistently worked with the connections between cognitive science and literary studies. So could you point out what brought you to connect these two fields in the first place, or what serves as the bridge you think that connects literary studies and cognitive science?
Well, I think the most powerful bridge, as you put in the question initially, is just the human mind. It's the human mind is prominent in literature, and it's prominent in, I mean, it's the topic of study in cognitive and affective science. And the reason I add affective there is that even though affective science is generally considered a sort of subset of cognitive science, since I work more on emotion than on information processing, I feel it's worth mentioning when talking about what I've done. In any event, the human mind with its recurring structures and processes, for example, for structures, you could take the different types of memory, such as long-term memory, long-term episodic memory, which is what we ordinarily think of as memory, memory of a specific incidents, uh, or long-term skills memory, which is remembering how to do things, and working memory, which is what you're keeping in mind at any given time when
Mhm.
addressing some other topic. Um, those structures and their characteristic processes would be things such as storage of how we store information in memories. We usually store fragments, which we then reassemble in light of current circumstances, so that Daniel Sachter, for example, argues that our current circumstances account for a great deal of what we seem to be remembering. We're not actually remembering it, we're constructing it out of fragmentary memories. Uh, Similarly, there are structures and processes involving emotions that I won't go into now, but they've obviously been important for my work. But in any event, all of those things carry over directly into literature because literature is centrally concerned with the human mind. And you could say that there are three types of human mind which we find in literature. Authors, obviously, recipients, such as readers, auditors, viewers, audience members, depending on what the medium is. Um, and we could also say, and characters. And I'll say something about the three of those in a second. But there are also three types of psychology that we might, it's a sort of loose division, but you could also say that there are three types of psychology that we tend to use in analyzing literature. One is whatever psychology is best by our current lights. So that would be the connection with cognitive science, since we probably have all sorts of stuff wrong in cognitive science, but it's the best we can do right now.
Mhm.
Another type of psychology that we use in literary study is folk psychology. That's our sort of intuitive psychology of beliefs and desires at least beliefs and desires is the way it's usually talked about. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's basically right. So every time you say, why was he doing that? Oh, he was doing that because he was jealous, or he was doing that because he wants to impress the department head or whatever. You're tacitly relying on means and reasoning and belief, desire, psychology, which is the folk psychology that we all use in most of our everyday lives. And by the three types, I mean, the third type I have in mind is what you might call elite theories of psychology for any given place or historical period. Going back to the three types of human mind in literature, authors, recipients, and characters, the authors and recipients are real people. So I think we're always best off to address them with whatever the best psychology is we have currently available. When I first started out as a graduate student, that was generally considered to be psychoanalysis, but that's changed radically in the last 30 years or 40 years. So that, 40 years, I guess. So that now cognitive science, cognitive and affective science hold that position. And the situation with characters, however, seems to be a little hazier. As you know, new historicists tend to emphasize, even cognitive new historicists tend to emphasize the historical elite psychological theories. For example, when they're doing Renaissance studies, they want to know what were the theories that were dominant among elite circles of interest in psychology in the 16th and 17th centuries. I could go into that in more detail, but it's probably too much for an interview. But my opinion is that that's not the wisest way to go in giving psychological interpretations of characters, because even somebody who learns elite psychology, and I mean, the sorts of things that would be taught in a medical school or would be taught by philosophers or whatever. The sort of person, when someone learns that sort of thing, one tends to apply it only in specialized contexts, so that the standard examples of this come from folk physics or folk statistics, also folk mathematics. So, for example, if you are throwing a die, anytime you throw the die, there's a 1 in 6 chance that the number 1 will come up, because there are 6 faces on the die, and only one of them is one dot. But if you throw 4 ones in a row, most people will say the chances of you throwing of the next throw being a 1 are reduced, but in fact they're not reduced. They're exactly the same as they always were. It's still 1 in 6. I had an amusing experience of this with a statistician, actually, at a conference I was speaking at, where when I was flying to the conference, my airplane was struck by lightning, which is apparently like a normal thing for airplanes, but it was kind of strange for us to hear it on the, over the I guess the PA system or whatever they have in airplanes. So I mentioned this to him, and he said, well, the thing about that is at least you can feel confident that there isn't much chance it'll happen again. And I thought this was amusing because in his professional life, he never would have said anything like that. He would have known that the chances of it happening the second time were precisely what they were for it happening the first time. So it seems to me unlikely that I think authors create their characters intuitively, and thus are likely to rely on folk psychology and not on elite psychology. And I'll end by just mentioning that Russell theory is a sort of exception to this. And the reason it's not really an exception, but it seems like an exception because the Russell theory actually applies within the specialized context of art. So if you substitute Russell theory for folk psychology, then you'll do it in precisely the context in which you're creating literature, music, or whatever. So it isn't eliminated by this special context criterion.
So I have a question about your work in affective narratology, which argues that narratives have the ability to trigger universal emotional systems, and then there are these cognitive templates or affective structures in narratives. So how is this analysis? And I found your especially analysis of story genres a bit like the work of Northrop Frye. So I would like to know how. Kind of these cognitive templates or these effective structures, they differ from formalist methods of studies.
Thank you for that question. First of all, let me just remark briefly on Northrop Frye. He was a teacher of mine, and I'm very sort of proud and happy that he was a teacher. I liked him enormously as a person, and he was vastly erudite about literature. Um, I took a class in Milton from him, and he uh, he had a copy of Milton, the complete Milton, that he brought to class that didn't have any annotations in it, and I mean, except things that he had marked. But he would ask things like, "What is Milton alluding to here?" And he'd expect some student to be able to say, "Well, that's book 3 of Ovid's Metamorphoses," or whatever. And he only expected those sorts of comments because they were so ready to hand for him. So I don't pretend to have anything like the erudition he had with regard to literature. He was also just a very, very nice person. But principally, I'd say the way that what I do or cognitive science generally differs from formalism is in its explanatory capacity. Now, not to be mean to Northrop Frye, but he has two things. One, he has like this setup where he parallels literary, not modes, I think it is. The parallel. You've probably read him more recently, and you could tell me which category this falls into. But he like parallels them with the seasons, and like that is like totally not an explanation of anything. The only excellent, and he calls them archetypes, but fortunately, he doesn't rely on Jung because that's just sort of loopy, giving an explanation that you have this. It's explaining the obscure and the obscure by reference to the even more obscure, explaining recurring patterns in literature by reference to a collective unconscious. Uh, anyway, so I try to follow the main in isolating genres and so on. I try to follow the main principles of theory construction in the natural sciences in order to generate algorithmic explanations. But anyway, okay, yeah. For example, I try to follow parsimony, minimizing the number of posits, explanatory posits, and so on, in explaining these genres, so that in fact I don't posit anything that isn't widely posited within the field of cognitive science generally. So I don't have, not only don't I have any mysterious theoretical posit like a collective unconscious, I don't have even, I don't even need like an extra type of, I don't even need an extra type of adaptation, for example. I mean, basically, I adopt belief, desire, psychology with regard to characters because I believe that authors create characters intuitively. So, plus empathy and what's referred to as parallel interpersonal stance. That is a stance that's open to that is well parallel to obviously that mirrors or is congruent with the emotions of the target. So if I have a parallel interpersonal stance, if you have a parallel interpersonal stance with me, and I have some sort of pain, then you'll feel pain empathically with me. If you don't have a parallel interpersonal stance, if you have an inverse interpersonal stance, then you might feel Schadenfreude. So So anyway, that's basically all I need to account for um, the genres which I've isolated. You can add to this and an evolutionary function, um, not a new one, but just what is the function of the elements that I invoke to explain the genres that I identify. As in case other people don't know, I guess I should mention the genres I identify are genres that recur across cultures. So, and most of them are fairly straightforward, such as the romantic genre, which is people falling in love, being separated, and striving to be reunited, and so on. An example of what happens when I take evolutionary function into account is my treatment of the paradox of fiction. The paradox of fiction is derives from the fact that we all know that we're reading when we're reading a novel or watching a play or a movie, that it's unless it's a documentary, that it's fictional. So in other words, we know that the people don't actually exist, and so but yet we might be crying over their fate. And why is that? It seems paradoxical because you can only be really upset about the fate of people who can actually suffer. And if they don't exist, they can't actually suffer. And so what I argue is that all of these are cases where we engage in simulation. Simulation is just a fancy cognitive way of saying imagination. Simulation is what we do when we're reading a novel. I mean, the novel doesn't automatically give rise to stories and images in our heads. Rather, we infer things and we envision the way characters are interacting and come to imagine their emotions and their conditions as they're described for us in the novel or short story or poem or whatever. And then we have an emotional response to that. Now, that means that what gives rise to the emotion is the simulation. It isn't the text itself, although obviously the text is closely related to the simulation. Now, I said in a moment ago that was my response to the paradox of fiction. Fiction, how does that respond to the paradox? Well, it responds to the paradox by removing the issue from fiction per se and seeing it as a general issue of the way simulation gives rise to emotion. Then the question becomes slightly different. It's much of the same, but it's slightly different, which is why do we have the same response to a simulation of hypotheticals or counterfactuals that we do to actual occurrences? And my response to that is to look at the evolutionary function of simulation. And it's sort of generally agreed that the evolutionary function of simulation is to allow us to make decisions about approaching opportunities or seizing opportunities and avoiding threats. We can do that by simulating the conditions and imagining the dire outcome in the case of threats or the pleasurable outcome in the case of opportunities. And thus we can act following the simulation in a way that maximizes our adaptive potential because it reduces the threat of reduces our approach to threats and increases our approach to opportunities. If that's true, oddly enough, no one has, as far as I can tell, until I started saying this, no one had remarked on the fact that this means that the evolutionary function of simulation can't be fulfilled unless simulation, whether it's counterfactual or whether it's factual or counterfactual, its evolutionary function can't be fulfilled unless it elicits emotion. And because if it didn't elicit any emotion, we wouldn't have any reason to find threats aversive. That's the way that it works. That's the way that it operates in making the threats aversive. So if you think of somebody like Joseph Campbell or Northrop Frye, it's pretty much unimaginable that either of them would be able to comment on how a simulation fulfills its adaptive function. Even though Frye especially was brilliantly erudite and was, I mean, the way that he could talk about even the most minor figures of the English Renaissance, of classical Greek and Roman writing with fluency and with a very precise memory. It's something to be in awe of. But the whole theory, basically all that he could say is that we have these, well, he only looked at the Western tradition. When he occasionally stepped outside of the Western tradition, but there his knowledge, I mean, he tried to gather some knowledge of Indian sources, for example, but he kind of booped things up sometimes. Um, but So he was left with basically the only explanatory principle he could invoke would be influence. These people, the modern writers read the medieval writers who read the classical writers and so on. So whereas cognitive science tries to give a more generalizable uh, explanation.
Yeah.
So
So
I think that answers your question,
yeah,
sort of.
yeah, it does. Yeah, awesome. And that also brings us to the next question that your work on literary universals, it's the cornerstone of your scholarship and also probably the more widely read ones, the most popular ones. So how would you respond to critics who would argue that this focus on cognitive patterns can cause a kind of cultural flattening of cultural diversity?
Yeah, that's a good question, principally because it is the sort of objection that arises frequently. It arises frequently as soon as you mention universal. You don't, people who raise the objection usually haven't looked at anything on universals. Um, but there are a couple of things to say about it. One thing that I hope to get back to in a moment is that I actually think things are going the opposite direction. I think it's people who don't recognize the universal patterns who are more likely to flatten out cultural diversity. So, um, but let me first say that I'm sort of skeptical of the concept of culture at all to begin with, because it seems to me that it more often refers to sort of, well, first of all, it refers to a self-concept rather than to practices of a group. And by that, I mean self-concept is the idea that people have of the sort of ways in which they act. So, and there are many different self-concepts that one can have about oneself and about one's culture. Um, some of them are hegemonic and are not. Others are incidental or idiosyncratic. And so when people refer to culture, they very often have in mind a hegemonic self-concept. They don't have in mind what I refer to as practical identity. Practical identity is the set of inclinations, skills, shared memories, anything that relates you to a community in such a way that you can interact with members of the community. So to take a simple and silly sort of example, driving on the right side of the road in the United States is part of every driver in the United States' practical identity. Um, and that's a sort of silly example because presumably uh, probably no one would name it as part of their culture. just because it's so sort of basic and well, arbitrary, because it can obviously go. I mean, there isn't some profound cultural difference between the United States and England because we drive on different sides of the road. But also, people are unlikely to get that one wrong. Uh, so they're unlikely to, the whole issue of it being a self-concept rather than practical identity doesn't fit very well. But I think it's an illuminating example to show what I mean by practical identity. Because it's a good example of the sort of thing that you do automatically and you do in a way that allows you to spontaneously cooperate with other people. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to negotiate about it. It just happens. And I think that is, well, obviously I think it's a valid, use of the idea of culture, but I think culture is often not used in that way, since it's often used for self-concept rather than actual practical identity. Now, this actually relates back to the first question on the human mind. Well, I mean, my answer was on the human mind as linking cognitive science with literature, because insofar as culture, in a significant sense, is not hegemonic self-concept, but is practical identity, then it's also, so to speak, idiolectal. It's a set of rules or practices that reside in you and in me, and then your practical identity and my practical identity are not identical. They're close enough that, when we get on the road, if you're driving toward me and I'm driving toward you, we'll both be on the proper side of the road. Um, but still, the principles that we follow, the dispositions that we have, the interests that we pursue, and so on, are personal to each of us. So here I'm following Chomsky's argument that language doesn't exist as an external entity. It rather exists only as what he calls I language, which is idiolects, which is these personalized sets of rules. So this relates back to the first question in the sense that it indicates why it's important to think of culture in the sense of practical identity in terms of the human mind. It doesn't reduce to the human mind, doesn't reduce culture to the human mind, because it aggregates culture across many individuals. And its aggregation of culture across many individuals involves their relations to one another and the ways in which their individual practical identities interweave with one another in such a way as to allow societies to operate, especially when they operate smoothly. Although when practical identities diverge, they can cause conflict, and that's something that one also has to take account of in treating culture. In any event, this view of culture emphasizes the necessity of conforming one's theories of culture to the operation of the human mind. As I said, conforming, not confining. So you don't want a theory of culture that doesn't fit with the way the human mind operates. So that returns me to the issue of whether the people who make this objection that you mentioned have things backwards or not. And the reason it returns me to that is that a great deal of social psychology, and I might mention that it doesn't have a role in a professional role today in universities, but social psychology has been as influential for me as cognitive science has. And just because it doesn't have that social status in the university, in English departments, I tend not to advertise. I mean, I'm not concealing it, but I tend not, people just don't know what to make of social psychology. It seems like two things. Social is about societies, that's groups of people, and psychology is about individual people. And so they find social psychology an odd combination, but it's actually what bridges psychology, cognitive and affective science, and so on, with the study of society. In any event, in social psychology, one of the central concepts is the distinction between the formation of in-groups and the formation of out-groups. The formation of in-groups and out-groups occurs through the attribution of identity categories. So that if if you take, say, Indian and Pakistani, there's if you actually take people, there's a great deal of overlap in people who fall in one category or the other. There may even be, or Hindu and Muslim. Ashish Nandi uses a number of examples of specific Muslim and Hindu sects that are close to one another in theology and in mystical or religious belief and practice, but who tend to fall out with one another when there are riots or when there are social clashes that fall under the heading of Hindu versus Muslim. So in that case, the identity categories are Hindu versus Muslim, even though the practical identities are continuous across these groups. There are more similarities than differences for most of the groups that Nandi talks about. Nonetheless, because of the identity categories, people form themselves into in-groups and out-groups. And a number of things go along with attributing to someone else an out-group status. And these include a non-parallel interpersonal stance, a view of the in-group as harder working, as even this is true even when you don't know the members of the in-group at all. Members of the in-group are presumed to be better looking, which is kind of weird. Anyway, there's a whole series of things like that that go along with, and you assume that out-groups are more homogeneous than in-groups. You recognize there's great internal diversity in your group, but when you talk about, not you, but when people talk about an out-group, the they or the them, they see them as pretty much uniform. So given this, it's unsurprising that insofar as a literary theory values or celebrates or affirms differences between groups, they're typically affirming or asserting differences between identity groups. And in asserting those differences between identity groups, they're assuming the identity. They tend to be assuming that the group they're discussing, they tend to treat the group they're discussing as an outgroup. And the reason that I say this objection has backwards is that a universalist presumption is a presumption that we're all part of the same in-group, so that doesn't diminish one's inclination to say there's diversity in the group, because one is always recognizes the greater diversity in the in-group relative to the out-group. But as I say, it doesn't, seeing others so-called as part of the in-group doesn't reduce their diversity. It actually enhances their diversity. I've just been reading David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, and I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but in that book they argue that the encounter between Europeans and indigenous peoples during the colonial period was such that the Europeans came to criticize various European ideas and practices because ingenious intellectuals criticized indigenous, excuse me, because indigenous intellectuals criticized those ideas and practices. So in other words, part of their project is to say that the European Enlightenment is actually derives from the indigenous critique of colonialism. And the reason I bring this up is that they're very disturbed by the fact that intellectual historians discount the contributions of indigenous thought and practice, so that even though many European writers acknowledge the indigenous sources of these critiques, intellectual historians tend to dismiss that. And they dismiss it in a way that's very similar to the way that some critics of the study of universals criticize that. So let me just quote a couple of things from their book, which I thought were interesting. Quote, indigenous people are assumed to have lived in a completely different universe, inhabited by a different reality even. Anything Europeans said about them was simply a shadow play projection, fantasies of the noble savage culled from European tradition itself. So this is their criticism of mainstream European intellectual history. And I think it largely applies to people who actually raise this objection to the study of universals.
So thank you for explaining these dynamics of the in-group versus out-group and the um, kind of Chomskyan idea of the ideolect versus how a lot of post-colonial critiques characterize the discourse as if it is a kind of self-operating external force, as you mentioned in your critique of science Orientalism. So how do all these dynamics relate to or change with the rise of large language models, which are drawing upon a vast resource of different kinds of texts? So how do a cognitive-based understanding of narrative structure or affective structure relate to these new forms of cognition, which are machine-based, or even kind of a new model of literature that can be produced using those models?
Yeah, I'm afraid that's one of your questions. That's the one of your questions that I have the least to say about, because my familiarity with artificial intelligence doesn't go much beyond gape-mouthed wonder and the occasional exclamation, "Dad, gummit, them thar machines can talk mighty fancy sometimes, can't they?" Um, but I will say that the broad criteria for creativity are unlikely to change. In cognitive science, again, I don't know if you know this, but there is actually a standard account. It isn't even really an account, it's really more of a definition of creativity that's sort of widely held among cognitive scientists who call themselves creative cognition theorists, is what they call themselves, unsurprisingly. So it's the definition is that an idea or action is creative if it is both innovative and apt. And apt in the sense that it furthers the aims of the creator. So I apologize if this is just overly simplistic because I know so little about AI, but it does seem to me likely that AI will be would be useful for testing many possible innovations swiftly, um, at least at a conceptual level. Um, though this is assuming that problems of codifying the variables of tacit learning and their resultant intuition are solved. That was a problem with some early language models that machines would give interpretations to sentences that were, in a sense, plausible, but that no human beings would have all sorts of tacit knowledge that would eliminate interpretations from the start that machines didn't have. But I think maybe those problems are being solved. I don't know. But even with those difficulties, I would think that AI could, in principle, process evaluative the evaluation of these of the creativity, the aptness, and innovativeness of ideas and actions more quickly. But I suspect that the desiderata themselves would not change. In other words, it would still be innovation and aptness. Now, in art, what does that amount to? Well, aptness often bears on beauty, but not everything in art bears on beauty, but a lot does. It would take us a little far afield for this question for me to go into detail about that, but I isolate different cognitive and affective criteria that collectively constitute beauty as a subjective response, not as an objective factor in the world, but just as a matter of what we respond to as beautiful. And AI, I mean, creativity would still be a matter of, even in the case of beauty and art, would still be a matter of those criteria along with innovation. So one criterion I mentioned was prototype approximation, which is similarity to a prototype. And a prototype in that context means basically a weighted average. Weighted average in turn means that your mind forms a prototype by categorizing objects. Objects are just anything you're experiencing. So people's faces, for example, and it categorizes them as faces, and it weights them for some contrasted category, and just averages them. And if this seems odd, you can find programs on the internet that will give you a sort of set of faces, like 16 faces, and you'll click on different ones, and the program will meld them together to produce an average. And I think you'll find that if you hit 4 or 5 of them, the result you'll probably find more aesthetically pleasing than any of the 4 or 5 that contributed to the composite. In any event, that's prototype approximation. Oh, and by weighted, I mean that suppose you were you're responding to male and female faces. Well, if you follow the program and put male and female faces together indiscriminately, you'll still get, in most ways, a face that you would find probably more aesthetically pleasing. But this will be more true if you divide it and click on male faces together and female faces together, because that will produce the weighted average. By weighted average, I mean women, for example, tend to have smaller jaws than men. And so the people in general tend to find a man's face better looking with a slightly bigger than average jaw, and women's faces is prettier to the extent that they have a slightly less than average sized jaw. So anyway, I think that AI could probably be operate to well, as it is in part in those programs I'm referring to. It's, I guess, an early version of artificial intelligence that's doing this. It can generate the sort of prototype approximation that the human mind generates, and also to evaluate those possibilities with greater speed than human beings could on their own. AI could also be recruited to other tasks of art. So, because I don't want to imply that art, whether literary or visual or musical, is confined to beauty. It's not. Some music aims to, such as some of John Cage's music, is aimed at getting us to hear the sounds of the world, not what we'd ordinarily consider non-musical sounds, to hear them differently. Or works by a wide range of authors, Emile Zola, Bertolt Brecht, are two that come to mind, are aimed at putting forth a political program through their characters and the situations their characters find themselves in. So in these cases, the resulting art, in these cases, I didn't say what the cases were. If AI is recruited to evaluate how other tasks of art can be fulfilled or satisfied, that those cases may result in art that may or may not look very different from literature, music, sculpture, etc., with which we are now familiar. However, I would say in sort of sum that as long as art is made for people and not for artificial intelligences, I suspect that both innovation and aptness will remain much the same, circumscribed by human limits. What I mean by circumscribed by human limits is that artificial intelligences could, in principle, abstract differences in prototypes or differences in rule-governed patterns that human beings are insensitive to. And that really, it would be impossible for that to make a difference to us because we would only know it as an abstract fact. Oh, well, artificial intelligence tells me that A is more prototypical than B, but I don't see a difference. So that's why I say it'd have to be, as long as art is made for human beings, it not only would the criteria, the two general criteria be the same, but it'd have to be circumscribed by human limits.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was really amazing.